In this video, we are going to explore one of the most tragic and decisive episodes in medieval European history. The sinking of the White Ship in 1120, a maritime disaster that forever changed the destiny of England and Normandy. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is a type of event that historians recognize as a turning point, a moment in which history abandons its predictable course and launches itself in an entirely new direction. There are events that do not merely end lives. They end entire eras, dissolve dynasties, redraw borders, and rewrite the future of nations. The sinking of the White Ship, known in French as La Blanche Nef, is one of those events. On the night of November 25th, 1120, in the icy waters of the English Channel off the Norman coast, a newly refitted ship sank just minutes after leaving the port of Barfleur. On board were about 300 people, including the heir to the English throne, illegitimate children of the king, earls, countesses, knights, chaplains, and young nobles from the most important Anglo-Norman families. From that entire group, only one person survived. But the true dimension of this tragedy can only be understood if we step back in time, if we return to the roots of Norman power in England, to the man who, with a single battle, conquered a kingdom and founded a dynasty. To understand what was lost on that dark and moonless night in the English Channel, one must first understand what had been built. In the year 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel with an army determined to claim what he considered to be his right to the throne of England. The pretext was a promise that had allegedly been made to him by the Saxon King Edward the Confessor, and an oath that Harold Godwinson himself had reportedly sworn to support the Norman claim. When Edward died early Guhe, Harold was crowned king by the Saxon nobles, ignoring William's claims. The Norman duke's response was relentless. On October 14, 1066, the forces of William and Harold met on the battlefield of Hastings. The struggle was long and fierce. The Saxons, positioned atop a hill, formed a shield wall that resisted Norman onslaughts for hours. The battle was only decided when the Normans employed feint tactics, simulating retreats to lure the Saxons out of their defensive position. Harold fell in combat. There are accounts, reproduced in the famous Bayeux tapestry, that he was struck by an arrow in the eye, although historians debate the veracity of this image. With Harold's death, Saxon resistance collapsed. William advanced on London, and on Christmas Day 1066 was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, becoming William I the Conqueror. The Norman conquest was a profound transformation of the entire social, political, and cultural structure of England. The Normans replaced the Saxon aristocracy, distributed lands among their knights, built castles throughout the kingdom, and imposed a new feudal order. The language of the court became Norman French, and the land ownership system itself was restructured. William ruled with an iron fist. Any resistance was crushed without mercy, as documented in the harrying of the North between 1069 and 1070, an episode of systematic destruction that left entire regions depopulated. By the end of his reign, William had consolidated a domain that stretched across both sides of the English Channel, Normandy on the continent and England on the island. But this very extension of domains carried within it a seed of conflict that would germinate in the following generations. William the Conqueror passed away in 1087, and with his death came the first great test for the continuity of Norman power. The Conqueror left three sons: Robert Curthose, the eldest, William Rufus, the second, and Henry, the youngest. The dying king made a decision that, while understandable within the feudal logic of the time, planted the seeds of decades of fratricidal rivalry. He divided his domains between his two eldest sons. Robert Curthose received Normandy, the family's ancestral duchy, the land of their forefathers. William Rufus received England, the kingdom conquered by the sword. As for Henry, the youngest son, no land was allotted to him. The conqueror left him only a sum of silver, an inheritance that, compared to those of his brothers, seemed paltry. Robert's nickname, Curthose, derived from Old French and meant something like short stockings, a reference to his short legs, a physical detail that, despite appearing trivial, was recorded by the chroniclers of the time as a sort of personal trademark. Robert was known as a brave man, but impulsive and not very skilled in the administration of his territories. Normandy, under his rule, became an unstable duchy where rebellious barons frequently challenged ducal authority. William Rufus, for his part, was crowned William II of England. His reign would be marked by deep controversies, but for now, what matters is understanding the scenario that the conqueror's death created. Two brothers ruling territories that, under their father, had functioned as a single domain, and a third brother, landless, watching and waiting for his opportunity. The division of William the Conqueror's domains created a politically unsustainable situation. Many Anglo-Norman barons owned lands in both England and Normandy, which meant they owed loyalty to two different lords, often in conflict with each other. This duality of loyalties generated constant tensions. Robert and William Rufus entered into a dispute almost immediately, each aiming to unify their father's domains under their own control. Henry, the third brother, deprived of land but not of intelligence, moved between the two with calculated caution. He was a patient man, an observer, capable of waiting for the right moment to act. For a time he served in the court of the King of France, learning the arts of diplomacy and continental politics. But his eyes never strayed from the ultimate goal, obtaining power and territory. While Henry waited in the wings, William Rufus's reign in England became increasingly problematic. William II was a ruler who inspired fear but little genuine loyalty. He surrounded himself with favourites known for their violence and corruption. The royal court became an environment where the powerful acted with impunity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle described him as a king, hated by almost all his people. His relationship with the church was especially conflict-plagued, as he kept bishoprics vacant for long periods to appropriate their revenues. His conflict with Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury became one of the most notable episodes of tension between the crown and the church. Despite his faults, William Rufus was a competent military leader who expanded English influence and even temporarily obtained control of Normandy. When Robert left for the First Crusade in 1096, he was an unpopular king, but effective in maintaining his power. Everything changed on a hot August day in the year 1100. On the second day of that month, King William Rufus rode into the New Forest in southern England for a hunting trip, accompanied by a group of nobles. Among them were Gilbert de Clare, his brother Roger, and a Norman noble named Walter Tyrrell, known as an archer of exceptional skill. Henry, the king's younger brother, also participated. What happened in that forest is one of the most debated episodes in English medieval history. At some point, the group dispersed through the dense forest. According to reports, William Rufus and Walter Tyrrell were together when an arrow was fired, hitting the king squarely in the chest. Death was swift. Walter Tyrrell immediately fled to France, and on his deathbed years later, he would still swear that he had not fired the arrow that killed the king. Abbot Suger, advisor to the King of France, recorded this oath, but true or not, the result was the same. The King of England lay dead on the floor of a forest. What followed the death of William Rufus is revealing of Henry's temperament and ambition. The nobles who accompanied the hunt simply abandoned the king's body where it had fallen. It was a local charcoal burner named Purkis who found the royal corpse and transported it in a cart to Winchester for burial. Henry, however, did not lose a moment. He galloped at full speed to Winchester, where the Norman royal treasury was kept. He announced his brother's death and claimed the throne for himself. There was initial resistance, but Henry, sword in hand, accepted no objections. He took possession of the treasury and set off for London, where just 3 days after the death of William Rufus, he was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. Henry I perfectly understood the symbolic and legal power of the coronation. Once anointed in Westminster Abbey, his right to the throne was practically incontestable. Robert Curthose, the eldest brother, was returning from the crusade and, when he learned of the events, found a fait accompli. Henry I was not just a skilled opportunist, he was also a ruler of remarkable administrative capabilities. Unlike his brothers, he was literate, fluent in English and Latin, which earned him the nickname Beauclerc. One of his first acts as king was to issue a Charter of Liberties, Coronation Charter, promising to correct the abuses of his predecessor and rule with justice. This charter set an important precedent. More than a century later, it would be used as a model for the Magna Carta of 1215. The rivalry with Robert, however, continued. The conflict culminated in 1106 at the Battle of Tinchebrai, where Henry decisively defeated Robert's forces. The eldest brother was captured and imprisoned for the rest of his life. Henry reunified his father's domains. He was now King of England and Lord of Normandy. With England and Normandy once again under a single ruler, Henry I dedicated himself to building an administrative apparatus that would ensure the stability of his government. One of his most lasting contributions was the development of the Exchequer system, a financial institution that revolutionized the way the Crown controlled its revenues. The name derived from a table covered by a checkered cloth, similar to a chessboard. The man behind this innovation was Roger of Salisbury, a Norman cleric of modest origins who became Henry I's most powerful advisor. Roger had attached himself to Henry even before he became king, and in practice functioned as a viceroy, administering the kingdom when the monarch was away in Normandy. The system worked like this. Twice a year, the sheriffs of the counties had to appear before the Exchequer officials to account for the taxes collected. On the checkered table, tokens and coins were arranged in squares, each representing a different value. The officials meticulously verified if the values corresponded to expectations, and dishonesty was punished severely. The records produced, known as pipe rolls, constitute some of the oldest administrative documents in English history. The title of Chancellor of the Exchequer itself, used to this day by the United Kingdom's finance minister, is a direct legacy of this institution. In addition to financial reforms, Henry implemented a system of itinerant judges who travelled through the counties to apply royal justice, laying the foundations of what would become English common law. Under his rule, England experienced a period of relative peace and prosperity. But if Henry I was a meticulous administrator, his personal life revealed a different side. The king was married to Queen Matilda of Scotland, daughter of King Malcolm III, a strategic union to bring the Norman crown closer to Saxon lineages, as Matilda was descended from the Anglo-Saxon royal house. With the Queen, Henry had two legitimate children, Matilda, born around 1102, and William, born in 1103. William received the title of Etheling, an Anglo-Saxon word meaning Prince of Royal Blood, a gesture to link the heir to the traditions of the people he ruled. The Normans called him Adelin. In addition to his legitimate children, Henry was notorious for his extramarital affairs, having fathered more than 20 illegitimate children with various mistresses. But he was not a negligent father. He recognized many of them and placed them in positions of power. Illegitimate daughters were married to important nobles, creating alliances that strengthened the network of loyalties to the king. It was a web of blood and power that stretched across the entire Anglo-Norman realm. Despite this abundance of children, the question of legitimate succession depended on a single person, the young William Adelin. As the king's only legitimate son, William carried the weight of the entire dynasty on his shoulders. Henry, conscious of the importance of preparing his heir, made William the Duke of Normandy, a title that allowed him to administer the duchy in his father's name and, crucially, to pay homage to the King of France for the possession of Normandy. This was a delicate matter of feudal protocol. Normandy was technically a fief of the French crown, and its holder owed homage to the French king. Henry, as King of England, considered it humiliating to kneel before another monarch. By transferring the ducal title to his son, he solved the problem elegantly. William paid homage to King Louis VI of France on behalf of the duchy, sparing his father's pride. With this arrangement, the future seemed assured. England was stable, Normandy was under control. The heir was trained and positioned, and Henry I's dynasty seemed destined to rule for generations. But fate, as so often in history, had other plans. We now come to the month of November 1120. King Henry VI, his son William, and a vast retinue of nobles, knights, officials, and members of the royal household were in Normandy. William had just paid homage to King Louis VI of France for the Duchy of Normandy, a ceremony that consolidated the political arrangement carefully orchestrated by his father. With diplomatic matters concluded, the group prepared to return to England. The starting point would be the port of Barfleur on the northwestern coast of Normandy, a port that was already traditionally used by Norman kings for crossing the English Channel. It was the same port from which the conqueror had departed in 1066 for his expedition that would change history. 2 ships were available for the crossing. Henry, with the prudence that characterized him, chose for himself a traditional, reliable vessel that had already proven its capability on previous voyages. The king, at that moment, probably did not imagine that this decision, seemingly routine, would save his life. For his son William, a different vessel was offered. A captain named Thomas Fitzstephen presented himself to the young prince with a proposal laden with symbolism. He offered him passage on his ship, the White Ship, La Blanche Nef. There was a special reason for the offer. Thomas's father, Stephen Fitzgerald, had been the captain of the ship Mora, the vessel that had transported William the Conqueror himself across the English Channel in 1066 during the invasion that conquered England. Thomas saw in this crossing an opportunity to perpetuate the family tradition of service to the Norman crown, carrying the conqueror's grandson on the same route his father had navigated with the grandfather. The White Ship was described as a newly refitted vessel, famous along the Norman coast for its beauty and speed. It was, in many respects, the height of modern and elegant navigation for the time. For William Adelin and his retinue of young nobles, accepting the offer to sail on the White Ship was not just a matter of convenience, but also of prestige. Associating oneself with that glamorous vessel was a demonstration of status. And so, while King Henry boarded his ship and departed prudently at dusk, the White Ship began to receive its passengers. The list of people on board was impressive. William Adelin, heir to the throne of England and Duke of Normandy, was the most important figure, but he was far from the only illustrious passenger. 2 of Henry I's illegitimate children were also on board, Richard of Lincoln and Matilda Fitzroy, Countess of Perche. There were cousins of the royal family, including Richard d'Avranches, Earl of Chester, and his brother Othuel. Present were heirs of the great Anglo-Norman families, nobles who represented the next generation of the ruling elite of England and Normandy. Knights, court chaplains, young aspiring knights who had gathered around the prince in the hope of gaining favor and reputation, all crowded onto the White Ship. In total, it is estimated that about 300 people embarked that night. The atmosphere on board was one of uncontrolled euphoria. The young nobles, relieved at the end of diplomatic formalities and anxious to return to England, turned the ship into a floating party. Dressed in their finest clothes, fine silks, fur-adorned cloaks, polished armor, they drank and celebrated without moderation. Barrels of wine were brought on board, and not just for the passengers. The wine was distributed generously among the crew, including Captain Thomas Fitzstephen himself and the rowers. Even before the ship left the port, sailors, royal guards, and nobles were already intoxicated. The accounts of the chroniclers paint a vivid picture of bravado and imprudence. Shouts and songs echoed through the port of Barfleur, and the lights lit on the ship's stern were visible to the residents on the coast. The scene was so disorderly that at least 2 monks from the Abbey of Tiron decided to disembark before departure. Observing that the ship was overcrowded and that the young people on board were too noisy and reckless, another person who made the same decision was Stephen of Blois, grandson of William the Conqueror, through his daughter Adela. Stephen, who was traveling with the royal group, observed the behavior of the passengers and judged that the situation was too dangerous. Some sources suggest he felt a stomach ailment, others indicate it was simply prudence that made him abandon the ship before departure. Whatever the reason, Stephen of Blois disembarked from the White Ship and sought another way to return to England. This decision, seemingly trivial at that moment, would have monumental consequences for the history of England, as we shall see later. In the confusion of the celebrations, few noticed Stephen's absence. The party continued, the wine circulated, and the night deepened over the port of Barfleur. King Henry had sensibly departed earlier, when conditions were still favorable. His ship was already well advanced in the crossing of the English Channel when the White Ship finally prepared to set sail. The delay was caused by the uncontrolled festivities on board. When the rowers finally began to lead the ship out of the port, the night was already thick and dark. There was no moon. The sky was black, and the sea, though calm, was an expanse of impenetrable darkness. The rowers, probably 50 men according to estimates, worked to guide the ship through the harbour waters and into the open channel. But even before completely leaving the protection of the port, someone made the fateful decision to hoist the mainsail. It was a dangerous manoeuvre, especially inside a port, as it drastically accelerated the ship's speed in a stretch where navigation required caution and precision, but haste and drunkenness prevailed over prudence. Reports indicate that the passengers, seized by the bravado of alcohol, shouted to the crew to catch and overtake the king's ship. The idea of beating the monarch in a maritime race seemed to them an irresistible adventure, a story they could tell for years. Captain Thomas Fitzstephen, confident in the speed of his beautiful ship and possibly as intoxicated as his passengers, accepted the challenge. The white ship launched itself out of the port at excessive speed, its sails inflated by the night wind, its rowers forcing the pace to the maximum. A few meters from the exit of the port of Barfleur, just past the point of Gataville, there was an obstacle that local sailors knew well, the Quillebeuf Rock, a submerged rock formation that hid just below the surface of the water. In normal navigation conditions, with a sober captain and an attentive crew, the rock would be bypassed without difficulty. But that night, nothing was normal. The white ship surged forward at full speed in total darkness, with a drunken crew and passengers who were turning the crossing into a competition. The impact was sudden and devastating. The ship's hull hit the Quillebeuf Rock with full force, and a massive gash opened in the side of the vessel. Seawater, freezing at that time of year, invaded the ship's interior with immediate violence. In a matter of minutes, the white ship began to capsize. Panic took hold of the passengers. 300 people, many of them drunk, dressed in heavy winter clothes, fur cloaks and chainmail, were thrown into the black and icy waters of the English Channel. Screams of despair echoed through the dark night. In the confusion of the sinking, William Adeline's personal guards acted with the presence of mind that the situation required. They managed to place the prince in a small lifeboat, a rescue vessel that the ship carried on board. William was rowed away from the sinking ship, and for a few precious moments it seemed the heir of England would be spared from the catastrophe. He was safe. The boat moved away from the wreckage, and the Norman coast was not far. William Adeline's life, and with it the future of Henry I's entire dynasty, could have been preserved at that moment. But then, something happened that transformed a tragedy into a dynastic catastrophe. From among the desperate cries of the shipwrecked, William heard a voice he recognized immediately. It was his half-sister Matilda, Countess of Perche, struggling to stay afloat in the icy waters, screaming for help. William did not hesitate. He ordered the boat to be turned and rowed back to the site of the sinking to rescue his sister. The rowers obeyed, and the small boat approached the wreckage of the white ship. But when they arrived at the spot, what they found was a mass of desperate people, clinging to anything that floated, fighting for survival with the energy of despair. Upon seeing the boat, dozens of survivors threw themselves upon it, trying to climb aboard. The small vessel, already overloaded, could not support the weight. Under the pressure of so many bodies, the boat capsized and sank, dragging down William Adeline, Matilda, and everyone who was in it. The heir to the throne of England disappeared beneath the black waves of the English Channel, and with him, all hope of a peaceful succession. In the minutes that followed, silence gradually replaced the screams of the shipwrecked. The water was at a lethal temperature at that time of year, and hypothermia did its cruel and efficient work. The nobles, dressed in their heavy silk, fur, and iron mail clothes, sank quickly, or if they managed to cling to the wreckage or rocks, died of cold in a short time. Their garments, which hours before had been symbols of wealth and status, became their shrouds, pulling them into the depths or freezing them against the stones. But there was a survivor. A single man among the approximately 300 people on board the white ship survived that night. His name was Berold, and he was a butcher from the city of Rouen. Berold was not a noble. He did not wear silks or furs. His clothes were of wool and leather, materials that, unlike the luxurious garments of the nobility, retained body heat even when wet. Berold managed to cling to the ship's mast or a piece of wood projecting above the water, and there he remained for hours, enduring the cold of the night until he was rescued by Barfleur fishermen the following morning. It was Berold who provided the most detailed account of what happened that night. He described how he saw the nobles with their heavy robes sink rapidly, unable to swim under the weight of their clothes. He described how others, who managed to cling to the rocks, were slowly overcome by the cold and slipped to their deaths. And he reported a detail that chroniclers recorded with particular emotion. Captain Thomas Fitzstephen, who initially survived the sinking and swam to where Berold was clinging, asked the butcher what had happened to the prince. When Berold told him that William Adelin was dead, the captain, overcome by shame and the horror of what his imprudence had caused, simply let himself slip back into the waters and disappeared beneath the waves, preferring death to facing the king's wrath. When the sun rose over Barfleur on the morning of November 26, 1120, local fishermen found only debris floating on the surface of the sea and the solitary body of Berold, still alive, clinging to a piece of wood. The list of the dead was devastating. William Adelin, heir to the throne, was only 17 years old. Matilda Fitzroy, Countess of Perche, the prince's half-sister. Richard of Lincoln, another illegitimate son of Henry I. Richard d'Avranches, Earl of Chester, and his brother Ottuel. Geoffrey Riddell, an important Norman noble. Countless knights, chaplains, young nobles, men and women, who represented the cream of Anglo-Norman society. The chronicler William of Malmesbury would later write that no ship that ever sailed had brought such disgrace to England, and that none had been so well known throughout the world. It was as if the political heart of England and Normandy had simply disappeared into the depths of the English Channel in a single night. On the other side of the Channel in England, King Henry V arrived safely and awaited the arrival of the White Ship with his son. But the ship did not arrive. Hours turned into days, and anxiety grew at court. Rumors began to circulate, increasingly grim, but no one dared confirm the tragedy to the king. The courtiers, many of whom had also lost children and relatives in the sinking, were paralyzed by their own grief and the terror of communicating the news to the monarch. Finally, when the truth could no longer be hidden, a young boy was persuaded to kneel before the king and tell him what had happened. The chroniclers' accounts of Henry's reaction are unanimous in their desolation. The king, who deeply loved his son, was devastated by the news. William of Malmesbury and Orderic Vitalis, two of the most important chroniclers of the period, recorded that Henry I, upon receiving the news of William Adelin's death, never smiled again. This phrase, repeated by chronicler after chronicler, became one of the most famous descriptions of royal mourning in medieval history. It was more than the pain of a father who had lost a son. It was the awareness that, with that death, everything Henry had built, all the political stability, all the careful dynastic architecture, all the hope of a peaceful succession, had disappeared under the waves along with the White Ship. Henry's personal tragedy was inseparable from the political crisis it triggered. With the death of William Adelin, the king was left without a legitimate male heir. Queen Matilda of Scotland had already passed away in 1118, and Henry decided to marry again, to Adeliza of Louvain, in the hope of fathering a new heir. But the couple was unable to have children. Confronted with this reality, Henry made an unprecedented decision. He designated his daughter Matilda as heir to the throne. Matilda, who had been married to Emperor Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire and carried the title of Empress, was a woman of strong personality. After the death of her first husband, Henry arranged a second marriage for her to Geoffrey V, Count of Anjou, the founder of the Plantagenet lineage. Henry forced his barons to swear on several occasions that they would recognize Matilda as his successor. The barons swore, but the oath was fragile. Matilda was unpopular. She was a woman, in an era when the idea of a reigning queen was unprecedented, and she was married to an Angevin, a traditional rival of Normandy. Among those who swore to recognize Matilda was Stephen of Blois, the same man who had disembarked from the White Ship on that fateful night. Henry I died in December 1135 in Normandy, after an extraordinarily long life by the standards of his time. He was about 67 years old. His death triggered exactly the crisis he had feared and tried to prevent. Stephen of Blois, breaking the oath he had made to the king, acted with the same speed and decisiveness that Henry himself had demonstrated 35 years earlier when he galloped to Winchester, after the death of William Rufus. Stephen crossed the English Channel, arrived in England before Matilda could react, obtained the support of key figures like Roger of Salisbury himself and his own brother Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, and was crowned King of England in December 1135. Matilda, who was in Normandy with her husband Geoffrey at the time of her father's death, found herself unable to reach England in time. The throne her father had fought to guarantee her was snatched away by her cousin. What followed was one of the darkest periods in English medieval history. Matilda did not accept Stephen's usurpation and, with the support of her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, one of Henry I's illegitimate sons, launched a military campaign to reclaim the throne. The civil war that followed, known as the Anarchy, devastated England for nearly 2 decades. Chroniclers of the time described this period with an emblematic phrase: "It was as if Christ and his saints slept." The Anarchy was not a war of great decisive battles, but rather a prolonged conflict of sieges, skirmishes, betrayals, and devastation. Barons took advantage of the weakness of central authority to build unauthorized castles and exploit local populations without restraint. In 1141, Matilda's forces captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln, but the Empress was driven out of London before she could be crowned, and Stephen regained control of much of the kingdom. The war continued without either side achieving a decisive victory. The resolution of the conflict only came in the next generation. Matilda's son, Henry, had inherited the energy and intelligence of his grandfather. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, becoming the lord of vast territories in France. In 1153, the young Henry landed in England with an army, determined to claim his grandfather's throne. But by this time, both the barons and the church itself were exhausted by the war. Neither side desired another decisive battle. Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, died unexpectedly that same year, leaving the king without a clear heir to continue his lineage. Negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Winchester, signed in November 1153, by which Stephen recognized Henry as his adopted son and heir to the throne. Stephen would continue to reign until his death, and Henry would succeed him. Stephen died in October 1154, and the young Henry was crowned as Henry II of England, inaugurating the Plantagenet dynasty, one of the most powerful and enduring royal lineages in European history, which would rule England for more than 300 years. The Civil War had finally ended, but the scar it left on England's collective memory never completely disappeared. Looking back at the chain of events that led from the night of November 25, 1120, to the coronation of Henry II in 1154, it is impossible not to reflect on how a single event, a single moment of imprudence, can alter the course of history irreversibly. The sinking of the White Ship was not caused by a storm, nor by an enemy attack, nor by an elaborate conspiracy. It was caused by a combination of drunkenness, bravado, and excessive speed on a dark night. A captain who had drunk too much, a crew that had lost its sobriety, passengers who turned a sea crossing into a competition, and a submerged rock that waited silently in the darkness. Conspiracy theories emerged over the centuries, as they often do when tragedies of great magnitude shake history. Some suggested that the ship had been sabotaged, that there was a political plot behind the sinking. The fact that Stephen of Blois disembarked before departure fueled speculation. But no contemporary source recorded any suspicion of sabotage or conspiracy at the time of the event. The chroniclers who wrote about the tragedy, including Orderic Vitalis, whose narrative is the most detailed and emotional of all, treated the sinking as a terrible accident, aggravated by human irresponsibility. The comparison with the Titanic is inevitable and surprisingly apt. Nearly 800 years before the great ocean liner hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic, the White Ship hit a rock in the English Channel. In both cases, they were vessels considered the best of their time. In both cases, the passenger list included members of the social elite. In both cases, the tragedy occurred on a calm, dark night, and overconfidence in the vessel and the reckless pursuit of speed contributed to the disaster. As historian Robert Lacey observed, the White Ship was the Titanic of the Middle Ages. The fundamental difference is that the sinking of the White Ship was also a political catastrophe that altered the destiny of two nations. The effects of that night in Barfleur resonated for decades. The loss of William Adelin left Henry I without a legitimate male heir and triggered a succession crisis that, after the king's death, plunged England into nearly 20 years of civil war. The anarchy destroyed much of what Henry had built, devastated the English countryside, weakened the authority of the crown, and strengthened the power of local barons in a way that would take generations to reverse. Researcher Harriet Stroll from Durham University demonstrated in a recent study published in the Journal of Medieval History how the tragedy of the White Ship resonated deeply through 12th century Anglo-Norman society, not just as a political event, but as a collective emotional trauma. The monk Orderic Vitalis, who wrote at the Norman Abbey of Saint-Évroult, recorded not only the names of the high-born victims, but also those of people who had connections to his own abbey, ensuring that their memory was preserved in prayers and liturgical practices. For Orderic, narrating the sinking was as much a historical duty as an act of faith and community memory. But from the ashes of the anarchy emerged the Plantagenet dynasty, and with it, a new era for England. Henry II, grandson of Henry I through his daughter Matilda, proved to be one of the most capable and energetic monarchs England has ever known. He restored order, reformed the legal system, expanded royal power, and laid the foundations of what would become the English legal system that would influence the entire world. The institutions his grandfather had created, the exchequer, the itinerant judges, the centralized administration, were not only restored, but expanded and perfected. The irony of history is that the sinking that nearly destroyed Henry I's work ended up through tortuous and painful paths, contributing to the emergence of an even more powerful dynasty and an even more sophisticated governmental structure. The story of the White Ship remains, 9 centuries later, as a warning about the fragility of power and the unpredictability of fate. In a single night, an entire generation of leaders disappeared. A father lost his son and, according to the chroniclers, never smiled again. A kingdom lost its future and plunged into decades of war. And it all began with a party in a Norman port, with barrels of wine distributed to a crew that should have been sober, with the bravado of young people who wanted to prove their ship was faster than the king's. History teaches us that great disasters are rarely caused by a single failure. They are almost always the result of a chain of errors, of imprudent decisions that accumulate until the fatal moment arrives. On the night of November 25th, 1120, all the links in that chain aligned in the darkness of the English Channel, and the result was a catastrophe that would resonate for centuries. In June 2020, divers conducted an expedition to the site of the sinking in the waters off Barfleur and reported the discovery of what may be a significant section of the hull of the White Ship, resting about 10 meters deep in the strong currents of the English Channel. The vessel, estimated to be about 40 meters long, may finally be revealing its secrets to modern underwater archaeology techniques 900 years after its fateful night. The wreckage, if confirmed, would be a tangible testimony to one of the greatest tragedies in medieval history, a physical link to that night when England lost its future in the dark and icy waters of the Channel. The memory of the White Ship has never completely faded from European historical consciousness. Over the centuries, poets, novelists, and historians have repeatedly returned to this tragedy, drawn by its elements of human drama, the youth and promise of the passengers, the irresponsibility that led to the disaster, William Adelin's act of bravery and brotherly love in ordering the boat to return to save his sister, and the loneliness of the only survivor, a simple butcher who witnessed the death of the cream of the Anglo-Norman nobility. It is a story that contains within it all the ironies and all the lessons of the human condition, the fragility of life, the vanity of power, the unpredictability of fate, and, perhaps above all, the truth that the consequences of our actions, especially the most imprudent ones, can extend much further than we would ever imagine. The White Ship sank in a few minutes. Its consequences lasted centuries. And so the next time you contemplate the calm waters of a channel or a strait, remember that, beneath the seemingly tranquil surface of history, there are hidden rocks waiting in silence, and that a single moment of carelessness is enough for the fate of entire nations to be altered forever. If this narrative engaged you, if it made you reflect on how a single event can redraw the map of history, Then become part of this community of the curious and those passionate about the past. Subscribe to the channel, leave your comment telling us which aspect of this tragedy impressed you the most, and share this video with someone who, like you, believes that knowing history is the best way to understand the present. Every subscription, every like and every comment helps us continue bringing stories like that of the White Ship to you. Until the next narrative.